The morning my brother live-streamed himself destroying my photography studio, he had over 200 people watching in real time. I found out because a client texted me a screenshot with 3 question mark emojis and no other explanation. I had opened Hololight Studio in a converted industrial space on the east side of Millbrook 4 years before any of this happened. I was 31 years old. I had spent 6 years working as a corporate event coordinator, which is exactly as glamorous as it sounds. I spent most of my time in parking garages and hotel ballrooms with a headset and a clipboard, managing vendors who did not want to be managed. I saved methodically, not aggressively, not with a spreadsheet on the wall, just consistently, the way you do when you have decided that the life you are building is the only retirement plan you trust. By the time I signed a lease on the studio space, I had $68,000 set aside. Every dollar of the build-out came from that account. I did most of the interior work myself over a span of 5 weekends. I installed the seamless white backdrop system using hardware I researched for 3 weeks before ordering. I refinished the concrete floors with a rental grinder and an epoxy kit I applied in 2 coats over a long Saturday. The lighting grid was the piece I was most particular about. I drove 40 minutes to consult with a theatrical lighting specialist and then spent 2 evenings running cable through conduit I measured 3 times before cutting. I named the place Hollow Light because I liked the idea of a space that existed to hold something, not to show itself off, but to make room for what came into it. By the second year, I had a wait list for newborn sessions. By the third year, 2 local wedding photographers were renting the space on weekday mornings for their own portrait work. My family had what I would describe charitably as an asymmetrical financial structure. My parents, my mother and father, who had lived in the same house on Cartwell Drive in Millbrook for 27 years, had 2 children. I was the older one by 4 years. My brother Jonah was the younger one. The accounting between my parents and Jonah over the years was, by any reasonable measure, substantial. They co-signed his first apartment lease when he was 23, and a second one when he was 26 after the first landlord declined to renew. They paid off a credit card balance of just over $18,000 after he called them from a parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon, which was how Jonah always delivered bad news. From parking lots on weekday afternoons, in a tone that implied the situation had simply happened to him rather than been generated by his own choices. They bought him a truck on the grounds that he needed reliable transportation for his landscaping work, though the landscaping work had effectively ended by the time they handed over the keys. They funded a food truck concept to the tune of $34,000. The food truck operated for 11 months, and the last 4 of those months it sat in a storage lot off Route 9 because the generator had failed and Jonah had decided repairs were not worth the cost. I never asked my parents for any of this. I also never received any of it, which I want to be clear I did not resent, or at least I told myself I did not resent it, for a long time, in the particular way you tell yourself things when believing them is easier than examining them. What I did not know, and had no reason to know, was that the money my parents had been extending to Jonah over the years had a source. My parents had a home equity line of credit on the Cartwell Drive property, which they'd opened 7 years earlier to fund what they described at the time as necessary home improvements, but which had, over time, become the structural underwriting of Jonah's financial decisions. The outstanding balance on that line was something I would not learn until after the live stream, and the existence of a specific clause in my commercial lease would be the mechanism by which I learned it. 13 months before the live stream, Jonah came to Hollow Light with a proposal. He had not called ahead. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of October, looked around the studio space, the lighting grid, the refinished floors, the custom backdrop wall I had built using reclaimed pine from a demolition site in the next county, and told me he was starting a content creation business, YouTube, short-form video, brand partnerships, that kind of thing. He said he needed a space to film 3 days a week and named a rate that was approximately 40% of what I charge for commercial rentals. I told him it did not work for me. He looked at the floors. He looked at the backdrop. Then he said, in the particular tone he used when he wanted to deliver a threat without being accountable for having delivered one, that our father knew the building owner socially. He said it the way someone says something that is meant to land softly. It did not land softly. I told him to leave. He left without arguing, which was somehow worse than if he had argued, because it meant he had already decided that arguing was not the tool he intended to use. I want to be precise about the key. After I opened the studio, I had given my parents a spare, because that is what you do. You give your parents a key, and you file it under the general category of family, being people you can trust with the ordinary logistics of your life. The key lived on a hook near their back door. I knew exactly where it was. I had never questioned it. The live stream went up on a Saturday morning at 9:43. I was at the farmer's market on Clement Street, 4 blocks from the studio, standing in front of a produce stand with a canvas bag and a cup of coffee, when my phone started buzzing with a persistence that was not normal. A text from a client. Then 2 more. Then a call from Petra, my assistant, whose voice, when I answered, had the careful, controlled quality of someone who has already absorbed the shock and is now managing the delivery of it. I looked at my phone. Jonah had let himself in through the side entrance. He was wearing a hoodie and work gloves, and he had his phone mounted on a small tripod he had set up near the door, which told me this had been planned with more deliberation than anything he had done in the previous 2 years combined. The seamless backdrop was already on the floor. He had pulled it from the ceiling mount, and it had torn along one edge where the bracket had resisted. He was working through the studio with a methodical quality I had never seen from him in any other context. At one point, he picked up a lens filter I had left on the equipment shelf and dropped it on the concrete. He looked at the camera when he did it. He was smiling. The caption he wrote was, "Not so hollow now." He had live comments running. There were people laughing. There were people asking what was happening. There were 214 viewers at the peak. He used the spare key, the key my parents had kept on the hook near their back door for 3 years. I did not cry at the farmer's market. I walked to Hollow Light and I looked at what was left, and I did not cry there either. There is a version of grief that does not express itself as crying. It expresses itself as a very complete and practical kind of quiet. I took photographs of the damage with my phone, working systematically from the entrance to the back wall, because Petra had already said the words, "Document everything," and she was right. The damage assessment, when it came, was $60,400. That number covered the backdrop system, the lighting grid where 2 of the fixtures had been pulled from the ceiling, the flooring in one section where a piece of equipment had been dragged, and the lens filter, which was a smaller number but which I included because it was mine and he had dropped it while smiling at 200 people. A detective named Officer Whalen arrived within 90 minutes and spent 40 minutes in the space. She handed me a card and told me the live stream was, from an evidentiary standpoint, comprehensive. I made one call. Her name was Judith Marin, and she was a civil litigator I had met through a former client who ran a commercial real estate firm. She was not a close friend. She was something I had come to value more than a close friend. She was someone who answered on the second ring and said, before I had finished explaining, "Send me the footage in your lease and don't move anything." I had negotiated my lease with the particular care of someone who had read enough small business horror stories to be afraid of the right things. I'd spent 11 days reviewing the document before signing and had worked through it with a contracts attorney whose hourly rate I had found uncomfortable at the time and now considered the best money I had ever spent. One of the provisions I had insisted on was a clause establishing third-party liability for any person who provided access, expressly or implicitly, to anyone who caused damage to the premises. My attorney had called it a joint liability provision. I had called it peace of mind. I had essentially forgotten it existed in the way you forget about smoke detectors. You install them because you understand the risk, and then you go back to living your life. Judith read the lease in just under 5 minutes. Then she asked me who held my spare key. I told her. There was a pause, the kind of pause that has a shape to it. "This clause," she said, "establishes your parents as implicit access providers. It is a joint in several provision and it is well drafted. Do you know if they have a home equity line on the Cartwell Drive property? I told her I did not know. I'm going to find out, she said. Don't call Jonah. Don't call your parents yet. Let me work for 48 hours. What Judith found in 60 hours of research was this. My parents had an open home equity line of credit with a lender called Cornerstone Federal, secured by the Cartwell Drive property. The outstanding balance was $89,000. The line carried a covenant, standard language in that class of instrument, though not all borrowers read it carefully, stipulating that any civil liability judgment or active claim exceeding $50,000 filed against the primary borrowers triggered a mandatory account review by the lender. My filed claim was $61,400. My parents were named as co-defendants. Judith filed on a Monday. By Wednesday, Cornerstone Federal had received a copy of the complaint. My father called me on a Thursday evening. He was not composed, which was unusual for him. He was ordinarily a composed person, and the absence of it was its own kind of information. He said I needed to withdraw the claim against him and my mother. He said the house was not something that should be part of this. I told him that the studio was not something that should have been part of this either, and that his son had used a key stored in his house to enter a space I had built and destroyed it in front of 200 people who watched it happen in real time. He said Jonah had made a mistake. I told him that a mistake is something you do once and feel bad about. Jonah had mounted his phone on a tripod and smiled at the camera. He said several more things. I heard them all. Then I said, as steadily as I could, that I loved him and that I was not withdrawing the claim. My mother did not call me directly. She had Jonah call, which I found, once I had processed it, almost impressive in its efficiency. Jonah's voice was different from anything I had heard from him before. The ease was gone. The particular performance of confidence that had run through every interaction I had with him for the past decade was simply absent. He sounded, for the first time in my memory, genuinely afraid. He said if the bank moved on the house, that was on me. I let the sentence sit for a moment. Then I told him that I had installed that lighting grid myself over 2 evenings in November, running cable through conduit I had measured 3 times before cutting, and that he had pulled 2 fixtures out of the ceiling while 200 people watched, and then captioned the video with a joke. I asked him to think carefully about which one of us had built this situation. He started to say something else. I told him Petra needed me and ended the call. Cornerstone Federal completed their account review in 31 days. They did not call the full line. That required a final judgment, not merely an active claim. But they issued a formal notice requiring my parents to either post $42,000 in additional collateral within 60 days or accept a refinancing at a materially higher interest rate. My parents did not have $42,000 liquid. This was not something I had known. It was also not something I had caused. The settlement was reached without going to trial. Jonah's attorney, a man named who called me on a Tuesday with a confidence that evaporated about 4 minutes into the conversation, around the time I asked him to locate and read the joint liability provision, negotiated a final figure of $54,500, payable in monthly installments over 18 months, with my parents listed as co-obligors on a personal guarantee. My parents signed. I was told by Judith that my mother had cried during the signing. I received that information and held it and did not know what to do with it, so I set it down. Officer Whalen called me the following week. Criminal charges had been filed. The live stream, time-stamped, his face clearly visible, 214 concurrent viewers. The caption still cached on 2 platforms after he deleted it, served as the primary evidence. Jonah received a conditional discharge and 200 hours of community service. The judge, Officer Whalen told me, had noted on the record that the premeditated nature of the documentation, the tripod, the gloves, the caption, weighed against leniency. I appreciated that. I want to say something about the community service, because the comments I read later had a lot of feelings about whether 200 hours was sufficient for $61,400 in damage. Legally, I understand what the conditional discharge means and why it was structured that way. Personally, what I kept returning to was not the number of hours but the specificity of the recording. He set up a tripod. He wore gloves. He dropped my lens filter while looking into the camera, and he smiled. That level of deliberation, I felt, deserved more than a misdemeanor outcome. But I am not a judge. I am a person who refinished her own floors and ran her own cable and built something with 4 years of her life, and the court determined what it determined. I reopened HoloLight Studio on a Tuesday morning in late spring. The new backdrop system was installed by a professional rigger I hired specifically because I wanted it done in a way that would last. The lighting grid had been replaced and upgraded. The insurance covered replacement value, and I used the difference to add 2 fixtures I had been considering for over a year. Petra came in early and put a small arrangement of yellow tulips on the equipment shelf. She did not ask if that was all right. She just put them there, which was the right call. My first client that morning was a family I had worked with twice before. A couple and their 2 daughters, the younger of whom was terrified of the camera in a way that reminded me of myself at that age. I spent the first 15 minutes just talking to her, not photographing anything, until she forgot I was holding anything. That is the part of the work that does not appear in the final images and does not appear in the revenue numbers and is, in my opinion, the only part that actually matters. My parents have my phone number. I have not blocked it. Neither of us has called the other since the settlement was signed. We exist in the same city the way 2 weather systems can share the same regional map. Present, overlapping in some technical sense, no longer in contact in any way that means anything. Jonah deleted the live stream from both platforms. The internet had captured it in 9 separate archives before he did. Several of those archives still have the comments section intact. I have not read it. I don't need to. HoloLight is open 5 days a week. Last quarter was the strongest revenue period since I opened. The flooring where the equipment was dragged has been refinished, and I cannot tell anymore where the damage was, which is either a testament to the contractor I hired or to the limits of what visible evidence can hold. The lighting grid catches the morning light through the east-facing windows at an angle I planned for when I was running cable on my knees with a flashlight in my mouth, building something I intended to be here for a long time. He called it Not So Hollow Now. I called it mine. There is a version of this story where I was supposed to absorb what happened quietly, preserve the peace, and accept that some people will never understand the difference between what belongs to them and what belongs to you. I didn't do that. I'm not certain I would do anything differently. The question I have not stopped thinking about is not whether I was right. The question is simpler than that. It is this: who holds a key to something you built? And do they understand what they are actually holding? There is a specific image I keep coming back to. It is not the live stream, it is not the flooring or the torn backdrop or the lens filter hitting the concrete. It is the tripod. The small, deliberate tripod Jonah had set up near the door before he touched a single thing in that room. That tripod is the detail that tells you everything you need to know about the difference between a mistake and a decision. I used to think that people who hurt you carelessly were the most dangerous kind. I don't believe that anymore. The careless ones act from impulse and often surprise themselves. What Jonah did required planning. He drove to my studio with equipment. He wore gloves. He framed the shot. There is a quality of character that reveals itself not in a single moment of anger, but in the 20 minutes of preparation that precede it. And I think about that quality often. What it means to know someone for 31 years and still not have seen that part of them clearly. What I have come to understand is that integrity is not something you have in good conditions. Anyone can be decent when nothing is being asked of them. The real shape of a person shows up in how they respond to someone else's success, to the existence of something they were not given, to a door that was not open for them the way they felt it should have been. Jonah looked at what I had built. 4 years, $68,000, 2 evenings running cable in the dark. And what he felt was not admiration or even indifference. What he felt was that it should not exist without him benefiting from it. That is not a temporary feeling. That is a structure of character. And yet I do not think the outcome of this story was inevitable. It was the result of choices. His choices, yes, but also mine. I spent 11 days on that lease. I hired a contracts attorney when the hourly rate made me uncomfortable. I insisted on a provision that my attorney called cautious and that I called necessary. I did those things not because I anticipated Jonas specifically, but because I understood, in some practical way I could not have fully articulated at the time, that the world does not reward you for assuming the best about everyone who has access to what you built. That kind of clear-eyed preparation, not paranoia, not cynicism, just the disciplined work of protecting what you have earned, is something I wish I had understood earlier. The hardest part of all of this was not the damage. The hardest part was the phone call with my father, who is not a cruel man and who has spent 27 years in the same house on Cartwell Drive and who did not fully understand what he had been participating in by keeping that key on the hook without asking what it meant. I do not think he meant harm. I think he meant to keep the peace, which is a different thing, and which has its own kind of cost. What I know now is that endurance is not the same as acceptance. I endured a lot in the years before the live stream. The asymmetry, the silence, the performance of family normalcy over a financial reality I was not allowed to name. What I did not do was accept that this was simply how things were. When the moment came, I did not absorb it quietly. I called Judith. I documented the space. I held the line through every phone call that was designed to make me feel that holding the line was the wrong thing to do. The studio is open. The light comes through the east windows at the angle I designed for. I still don't know if I made the right call on every piece of this, but I know I made it with everything I had, and I know the difference between hollow and empty, even when someone else can't.